Thanks for listening to the ArtTactic Podcast. I'm your host, Adam Green. Frieze Art Fair is launching their inaugural edition of the fair in Seoul, Korea next week, and there's a lot of buzz about the fair. I'm already receiving previews from galleries, and they're bringing really great material, which I think is a sign of their beliefs about the potential of this fair. There's also a lot of excitement and curiosity about the art market in Seoul. So leading up to the fair, in this week's episode, we chat with Andy St. Louis, a Seoul-based art critic. Andy is the Seoul desk editor at Art Asia Pacific and a contributing editor at Art Review Asia. And in 2018, he founded Seoul Art Friend, an online platform dedicated to promoting contemporary Korean art, which you can access now at soulartfriend.com, or on Instagram and Facebook. You can follow them at Seoul Art Friend. We hope you enjoy this interesting conversation with Andy. Thanks so much for listening. Andy, thanks so much for joining us from Korea.
Thanks for having me. I'm so happy to be here.
Definitely. Well, you've been in Seoul for a long time, and we're very eager to hear your perspective on everything happening there, as there's a lot of energy surrounding Frieze Art Fair and, more generally, the art market there the past few years. So tell us, how did Seoul become a burgeoning contemporary art hub? It seems to have happened so suddenly for people not paying close attention.
Yeah, I mean, Seoul has been sort of quietly developing as a regional player in the contemporary art scene for a number of years, of course, based in Seoul, which is the capital of Korea, where roughly half of the country's 50 million people live. Korea has a rich art history of its own and a strong, tradition of support for the arts. Some of the most prominent examples of this are like the Gwangju Biennale, which is the longest running biennial exhibition in Asia, the Korean Pavilion at the Venice Biennale, and both of these, operate on public funding. So you have really strong support at the government level for art here, and you also have a really significant domestic collector base that is very sophisticated. You have a highly developed art scene with world-class museums and galleries, and just a general sort of deep appreciation for visual culture within Korean society as a whole. So how did we get here to the point where Frieze Seoul is launching its inaugural Asian fair in the city? I think a lot of it has to do with the Korean collectors. At least it sort of starts from that. So for the collectors here, art has become a much more appealing investment in recent years due to some of the real estate regulations that were introduced by the previous president, Moon Jae-in. And this basically raised taxes for owners of multiple properties in order to reduce kind of a rampant real estate speculation, especially in Seoul. And so with those tax increases, people began to look for other avenues to invest, different ways to diversify their portfolio, and art became a very attractive way to do this. The new president, Yoon Suk-yeol, who was elected this year, he has introduced some new tax reforms that might sort of undercut those previous regulations. But to this point, that's been a real driver of interest from collectors across the board. Another sort of, I think, really significant influence on public opinion toward art collecting was the donation of the former Samsung chairman. His name is Lee Kun-hee. He passed away 2 years ago. And what ended up happening was his art collection was donated to the state, which was a decision by his family because they were facing this massive estate tax burden of about 10 billion US dollars. So his collection of like 23,000 artworks and objects went to the state, and highlights from this collection, paintings and sculptures, went on view at the National Museum of Modern and Contemporary Art in the summer of 2021. And then there was so much interest that the exhibition ended up being extended twice in order to accommodate public demand. And it stretched to about 11 months total. And the impact of this was as Korea's richest man, Lee sort of represented the pinnacle of success for Koreans, I think, of all ages. And when people went to see the show, the quality of the works was pretty breathtaking. The exhibition, I think, opened people's eyes to art collecting as a really aspirational form of investment, and obviously increasing one's cultural capital while also supporting Korean artists and building a legacy of sort of art historical merit. If we look at the domestic market, how it has increased and expanded in the past few years, it's been quite unprecedented. In 2020, the total sales of the art market were around 329 billion Korean won, which is about 246 million US dollars. And in 2021, the number was 922 billion won, or around $690 million. So that's, 280% increase in just 1 year. In 2002, so far, the first half total is already at 563 billion won, or $420 million. And so it's sort of on pace to break the 1 trillion won mark, which is about $750 million. And especially as we look toward the fall art fair season with Frieze and Kiev, which is the largest domestic fair, those are expected to generate pretty strong sales. And it seems that we're going to see really incredible growth again this year. But it's not just Frieze and Kiev. I mean, the market has grown across the board in terms of art fairs. There have been 19 new art fairs that have launched in the past year here in Korea. And I think it's also important to sort of step back and think about more long-term growth potential in light of possible implications of a bubble or some kind of boom and bust situation here. The domestic art market in Korea accounts for just 0.02% of GDP, compared to about 0.1% or 0.2% in other industrialized countries. So there's really a lot of room for growth. The Korean economy continues to expand year on year, thanks to increased consumer spending and export demand. And so, the question is really, we've gotten to this point where Seoul is now a viable place to do business, a viable place for international galleries and domestic galleries alike to really consolidate their position and bring Seoul into a position of market viability long term. Will it compete with Hong Kong? Will it displace Hong Kong as the dominant regional art market? It's not certain. I think a lot of people are wondering the same thing. Hong Kong has been the center of the Asian market since the late 2000s. But developments there in the past 2 to 3 years have really made the art world a bit wary of the long-term prospects of doing business there. First it was the protests, then COVID, then censorship by the Chinese government. And then on top of it all, you have these sort of skyrocketing rents for galleries there. And so I think people have been increasingly looking for an alternative in the region that would allow the same access to the Asian market while avoiding some of the headaches associated with operating in Hong Kong. Korea, like Hong Kong, does not impose any VAT or import tax on the sale of artworks, which makes it a very appealing place, especially for international art galleries. And Korea also has a very robust arts infrastructure and a thriving artist community, two things which I think Hong Kong is notably lacking. And so we're seeing more international galleries opening locations in Seoul. And I don't think it's really a hedge against any possible downturn in Hong Kong or any sort of reversal of fortunes in Hong Kong. But I think it's really people seeing Seoul as a legitimate art market hub in its own right. And then you have to factor in the undisputed attraction of Korean pop culture, which is now really well entrenched in mainstream society. First, it was sort of Korean food. Korean barbecue. Who doesn't like doing an all-you-can-eat Korean barbecue? Then K-pop with BTS and Blackpink, cinema with Parasite, and TV with Squid Game last year. There's a lot of different sort of areas in which Korean culture has really grown in terms of recognition and respect. And I think it's sort of only logical that Korean contemporary art could be the next avenue, the next channel that can sort of hold the global imagination and continue to expand Korean culture to the world more generally.
So, what is the infrastructure of the art market like in Seoul in terms of the galleries, museums, artists, collectors, and how they engage with one another? And what would you say are some of the similarities and differences between it and the art ecosystems of some of the other major art markets?
The arts infrastructure here is quite expansive, I think more than most people are aware. Of course, most of the artists and the collectors and the museums and spaces are concentrated in Seoul. And I would say it's sort of led by these legacy galleries like Hyundai, Kukje, also Arario and PKM. They're sort of at the top of the commercial sector. And they represent a mix of, established Korean artists, generally older, and also, an assortment of blue chip international artists. But then you also have a growing number of mid-level and emerging galleries that sort of support the broader spectrum of Korean artists, the local art scene here. In terms of how they are similar or different to galleries in other countries, it's interesting. The system here is certainly different from what is happening in the United States or in European countries. There's not as much of a established sort of feeder system. There's not this sort of expected progression of younger artists to move from smaller galleries to mid-level galleries, and then finally to these sort of mega galleries. In a lot of cases, it's sort of all or nothing here in Seoul. However, as I sort of alluded to before, there's really a lot of public funding here, and that is really an essential part of the ecosystem. So for young artists who are fresh out of their MFA or whatever, there are not a lot of opportunities coming from galleries. There are not a lot of sort of commercial opportunities. And in lieu of that, the government provides really generous funding, which would allow these artists to present solo exhibitions, to rent spaces, to publish catalogs, to embark upon projects that would not be supported otherwise. And so, I think a lot of people tend to discount the Korean gallery system because of its differences to what is sort of accepted as the standard in the rest of the world. But it actually functions very well here. And that's not to say that it cannot be improved, but I think a lot of people are not aware of just the sheer level of public funding that is available and that is really expected actually for artists on the emerging end of the spectrum. And that extends to artist residencies, that extends to other sort of artist-run spaces and alternative spaces that, are not commercial in their purview, but have strong support and allow this sort of other segment of the art world to still be present and to still have some place among these more sort of dominant commercial galleries. Aside from the galleries, I should just say one more thing, that the number of galleries itself is pretty significant. I mean, Seoul has around like 150 commercial galleries, which I think is a lot more than most people would expect. I mean, Hong Kong has less than 100. And these are galleries that are taking part in domestic art fairs as well as regional art fairs in Hong Kong, in Shanghai, Taipei, Tokyo, etc. And then you have the likes of Kukje and Hyundai, these sort of top level galleries. There are also regular fixtures at the various Frieze and Art Basel affiliated events worldwide. And then since 2016, we have Western galleries that are beginning to join the scene and join the fray. The first of which was Perotin, then Pace, and Lema Mopen. And all three of these really consolidated their place here within the last year by either expanding or opening new spaces. And then you had this sort of second wave with various small fires. Today has Ropak, excuse me, Gladstone, Koenig, Perez projects. And what's really notable about that second wave is that all of those galleries chose Seoul over Hong Kong as their regional beachhead or as their sort of entry point to the Asian market, which I think really says a lot about the growing level of confidence that international art dealers have about their long-term prospects here in Seoul. Museums, also pretty amazing here. There's more than 50 public and private museums in the Seoul metropolitan area. We have the federally funded National Museum of Modern and Contemporary Art. We have the municipally funded Seoul Museum of Art. And then you have an assortment of private museums, the most prominent of which are Liam Museum of Art, Art Sanjay Center, Amore Pacific Museum of Art. These are mostly funded by corporate cultural foundations. And then you have the biennials. So Gwangju Biennale, which I mentioned earlier, also Busan Biennale and Seoul Media City Biennale, which are really important entry points for international artists into the domestic art scene here. But I think, the most important thing about Seoul is its artist community. There are so many artists and so much talent here. I mean, there are serious art schools. There is an extensive network of artist residencies. And as I said before, the funding is really essential to allow for all these things to sort of coexist and to support a really dynamic and viable sort of art ecosystem. There are literally hundreds of exhibitions in Seoul every month. There's always something to see, always new artists to discover. And, with more attention on the Korean art scene going forward, I think it's only a matter of time before the rest of the world really takes note of what's actually going on here.
Yeah, and you spoke about all these Western galleries opening up spaces in Seoul rather than Hong Kong or mainland China. This is a little bit of a chicken and egg kind of question, but is the embrace of the Seoul art market being driven more by Korean collectors already being interested in non-Korean Western artists, or is it Western galleries trying to penetrate this potent and exciting market, or is it a little bit of both?
Yeah, I mean, I think, it's being led by these sort of top level domestic galleries. I think that's sort of the foundation. That's where a lot of the collector base has been developed. And you do have a strong tradition of collecting here in Seoul. You do have a lot of wealth here in Seoul. And Seoul's location is very convenient for much of East Asia, at least, talking China, Japan, Korea, Taiwan, even down to Hong Kong. But looking at what is driving these galleries to come here, galleries from the United States or from Europe, they have a lot of Korean collectors already. As these collectors have developed, as they've sort of begun to expand their collections and in many cases acquire much higher value works. They have been working with these galleries, Pace, Lima Mopen, Tadeusz Ropak, for a number of years. And so these galleries see that there is a strong and passionate and devoted collector base here. And so the risk is sort of mitigated by knowing that they do have this stable base. where the artists that they bring in, they're going to be able to place their works. The market for Korean art is doing very well. Korea also has its own set of auction houses, which are a major factor in driving art sales domestically. But is it the chicken or the egg? I think it's both, and it's neither. I mean, you need to have a history, you need to have a tradition, an understanding of collecting, and develop a sort of connoisseurship to desire, to expand your collection, to know what you're after, and how to get it. And so a lot of these galleries, it's a business just like any other. And so the Korean collectors, that sort of demographic is strong. And also the proximity to collectors in Japan and China makes it even easier. It allows for sort of logistical shortcuts, consolidating shipments, having a team based in Seoul that also works with collectors in China, that works with collectors in Japan. And so I think it just makes sense for a lot of these people, a lot of these galleries. And as I said, this sort of second wave, they, for whatever reason, and there are numerous reasons, but they've decided that Seoul is a better place to start here. And Hong Kong is just not as appealing as maybe it once was.
So let's talk a little bit about Frieze Art Fair and the fact that it will have its inaugural edition in Seoul next week. How did all this come about? Frieze coming to Seoul, choosing Seoul as its Asian location for a fair. What do you think are some of the reasons why they chose Seoul? And locally, what are people's expectations for how this inaugural fair will go?
I've spoken with Victoria Siddall at Frieze and tried to get some of these answers as well. And I'm not privy to all the internal discussions, but as far as I can tell, it was a long time in coming. I think there was an impulse to join the Asian market somehow on Frieze's part, and I think for a number of reasons, Seoul just made the most sense. And I think a lot of that, honestly, is personal relationships. They picked Pat Lee, to be the director of the fair. And Pat is a really well-respected and established fixture in the local art scene. He's a veteran art dealer. He's an American guy who has really succeeded in the art market here, working at a few galleries. I think he has really been one of the important, he's been sort of a fulcrum or an exchange point that Frieze has used to solidify their confidence in what they're doing here. There's been a really significant initiative to tap into the local community in terms of presenting also emerging Korean galleries. There's a sector of the fair focused on emerging Asian galleries, curated by I believe a Korean curator and an international curator. And I think Hong Kong was just not necessarily the first choice for Frieze. I think Frieze is sort of content to allow Art Basel to operate in Hong Kong, and sort of make Seoul their own. And for a lot of the reasons I talked about before, I think Seoul is an extremely attractive place, not just for art, but for travel in general. That said, having the buy-in from galleries like Pace and Perotan and Lim Open, having them already here and established for 5-6 years, I think demonstrated a lot of potential for success and sort of long-term confidence and staying power. showed Frieze, I think, as well, that the local collector base is, is very real, and is very significant. What's interesting about Frieze this year is that they've partnered with Kiev, which is the sort of premier domestic art fair. They've been running for like 20 years. It's the most important fair on the calendar, and they're running the fairs concurrently. So Frieze is on one floor, and Kiev is on another floor of COEX, which is Seoul's sort of massive, convention center. It's definitely an unusual arrangement, I think, for Frieze. There's no tent. There's no sort of unique location, which they have sort of made their trademark. But to me, I think, it might be just what Frieze needed in order to allow for a kind of smooth and successful debut here. I mean, a lot of the logistics responsibility is shared. Kiev has had this date, at COEX for a long-standing date at COEX, and so I think it made sense for Frieze to sort of join, and if not collaborate, at least sort of cooperate, and run the fairs side by side. The tickets for both fairs are exchangeable, so visitors will be able to go back and forth, which I think is necessary, although I'm not sure realistically how much overlap there's going to be. I think most people are going to focus on Frieze. But that said, the demand, I think, is very high. I'm sure it will sell out just like every Frieze art fair. And what people expect, I think no one really knows. I think, at Kiev in years past, we've had a selection of foreign galleries, mostly galleries that already had brick and mortar spaces here. So Paratanli, Mopen, even Gladstone, some other galleries that are regulars. Also Esther Schipper and Perez Projects. They've done the fairs in years past, but it's always been a pretty small cohort of international galleries. But this year the list is it's sort of a murderer's row of top international galleries coming. And as you said, it seems they're bringing really serious works to place. And I think it's going to be really eye-opening for the Korean audience. I think for the Korean collectors, it's going to be, a kid in a candy store. And I think everyone expects pretty strong sales, myself included. And it's very exciting in that respect. Frieze is also running all of its usual VIP programs, talks, studio visits, etc. But they're also doing a film program, which I think is actually very interesting. They're collaborating with an LA-based nonprofit called Kyopo, which is sort of a Korean-American networking and sort of creatively oriented nonprofit doing events and other cultural activities, as well as this local Seoul curatorial collective called WES, which is very well regarded in the local scene. And they're going to present recent works by, I think, 10 or so of Korea's leading video and media artists. So, as a corollary program, you never know how many people are going to take advantage of it. But I do think it's a noble initiative, and I think it signals, Frieze's interest in really tapping in and connecting with the local community.
Well, we're really excited to see how the fair goes. And I know on this episode we've been talking about a lot of the positives about the development of the Seoul art market. What would you say are some of the challenges maybe facing the Korean art market in the short and medium term that they need to address as this market continues to mature?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a question that everyone has. I think from what I can tell, Frieze is very serious about its commitment to Seoul, and I think that bodes well for the near future. In terms of the challenges that I can see, just politically, it's possible that the new president might neutralize some of these business-friendly tax policies. The conservative President Yoon, that would obviously sort of throw a wet blanket on the excitement and the eagerness to open spaces here. I think there's definitely a language barrier that is more pronounced than that in Hong Kong. However, I don't think that is a serious challenge. I think it's just something that needs to be sort of worked around or finessed if possible. Honestly, and this is speaking as an art critic and a writer, I think there's a huge need for more local press, especially English language press. Compared to Hong Kong, we're just really lacking in that department. And I think that's essential for conveying and really educating the global art world about what's happening, and really can help to inform and promote the local scene and the local artists. And I think that's really essential for the long-term success of Korea and Seoul as a legitimate art market, is that the local artists have a seat at the table, be recognized for their vision, their talent. And I think that takes time and that takes strategy. But if that doesn't happen, I think it puts people here in a strange position where, Seoul just becomes a marketplace and not a true sort of contemporary art hub, which by all rights it should be. So again, no one knows the answers to these questions. And I think if you talk to me again in 2 weeks after Frieze is over, I might have some more opinions on this. But from where I stand, I think there's a lot of hope and certainly a lot of expectation for the success of this fair. So yeah, looking forward to it.
Definitely. Well, Andy, thanks so much again for coming on to the podcast. We really enjoyed hearing your perspective being there in Seoul. For any of our listeners who don't already, they should check out your writing in Art Review and in Art Asia Pacific. And of course, you have Seoul Art Friend, which you founded in 2018, that our listeners should definitely check out. Tell us a little bit more about that platform that you've established.
Yeah, thanks. My writing is usually published in Art Asia Pacific or Art Review Asia, although I do contribute here and there to other publications. But Seoul Art Friend is really my main focus. SeoulArtFriend.com. We have listings, exhibition listings for the hundreds of shows that are on view in Seoul every month, as well as some interviews and other content, neighborhood guides for people who are looking to get out there and experience everything that the city has to offer.
Perfect. Andy, thanks so much again. We really appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thank you, Adam.